The whisper of truth. The air in Gaza was thick with the scent of dust and despair, a city carved from resilience and scarred by conflict. At dusk, the sky bled orange and purple, casting long shadows over the crumbling streets near Al-Shifa Hospital. Amira Khalil, a 28-year-old journalist with a fire in her eyes and a notebook worn thin by relentless use, stood outside the hospital's gates, her camera slung across her shoulder like a soldier's rifle. The hospital was a beacon of hope and a crucible of sorrow, its walls echoing with the cries of the wounded and the whispers of those who dared to document the truth. Amira had always believed in the power of words. As a child, she'd sit cross-legged on the floor of her family's small apartment in Deir al-Bala, listening to her father recite poetry by Mahmoud Darwish. His voice, deep and weathered, would weave tales of olive groves and lost homes, planting in her a dream to tell stories that mattered. She wanted to be a voice for those silenced by the world's indifference, to shine a light on the lives caught in the crossfire of a conflict older than her years. Now, as a freelance journalist for an independent news outlet, she chased the dream through the chaos of Gaza, where every day was a gamble between truth and survival. Tonight, she was waiting for a source, a nurse who had promised to share evidence of medicine shortages at Al-Shifa. The hospital, a sprawling complex of concrete and desperation, was the heart of Gaza's medical system, yet it was buckling under the weight of war. Amira's latest story aimed to expose how the blockade was choking the supply of life-saving drugs, leaving patients to die in silence. Her fingers tightened around her notebook, where she'd scrawled the nurse's name, Layla. A single word, a fragile thread of hope in a story that could change lives. The street was alive with movement. Vendors packing up their carts, children darting through alleys, and the distant hum of drones that never seemed to fade. Amira's heart quickened at the sound, a reflex honed by years of living under skies that could turn deadly in an instant. She glanced at her friend and fellow journalist, Sami, who leaned against a nearby wall, scrolling through his phone. His dark curls were matted with sweat, and his usual grin was replaced by a tight-lipped frown. "Anything new?" Amira asked, her voice low. Sami shook his head. "Just more threats. Anonymous accounts saying we're stirring trouble." "Same as always." Amira nodded, her jaw tightening. Threats were part of the job, shadows that followed journalists like her and Sami, who dared to report on the ground. She thought of Anas al-Sharif, a colleague whose relentless coverage of the starvation siege had made him a target. Anas had a way of speaking truth that cut through the noise, his words a lifeline for those trapped in Gaza's margins. They'd met at a press conference months ago, his quiet courage inspiring her to keep going despite the risk. Now, rumors swirled that he was being watched, his name whispered in the wrong circles. "Let's focus," Amira said, brushing off the unease. "Layla should be here soon." As the sun dipped below the horizon, the call to prayer echoed from a nearby mosque, a haunting melody that mingled with the city's pulse. Amira adjusted her hijab, her fingers brushing the small silver pendant her mother had given her, a tiny olive branch, a symbol of peace she clung to despite the world around her. She was about to check her watch when a sharp crack split the air, followed by a deafening roar. The ground shook, and Amira stumbled, her camera slamming against her chest. Dust clouded her vision, and screams pierced the twilight. Instinct kicked in, she dropped to her knees, shielding her head as debris rained down. The world was a blur of chaos, but through the haze, she saw flames licking the sky where a journalist's tent had stood moments ago, just beyond the hospital gates. "Sami!" she shouted, her voice hoarse. "I'm here," he called back, crawling toward her through the dust. His face was streaked with dirt, his eyes wide with panic. "What the hell was that?" Amira's heart pounded as she scanned the wreckage. The tent, a makeshift hub where journalists gathered to share stories and recharge, was gone, reduced to a smoldering crater. Her mind raced to the colleagues she knew were there: Hassan, who always carried a thermos of tea, Noor, who sketched cartoons to cope with the stress, and Anas, who'd promised to meet them tonight to discuss a joint story. "No," she whispered, scrambling to her feet. "No, no, no." She ran toward the crater, ignoring Sami's shouts to stay back. The air was thick with smoke, the stench of burning metal and blood overwhelming. As she reached the edge, her breath caught. Bodies lay scattered, some motionless, others writhing in pain. Her eyes locked on a familiar figure. Anas, his camera still clutched in his hand, his face bloodied but serene, as if he'd been reaching for one last truth. Amira fell to her knees, her hands trembling as she reached for him. "Anas, please," she choked out, but there was no response. The weight of his loss hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath. He was more than a colleague, he was a mentor, a friend, a beacon of courage in a world that tried to extinguish it. And now, he was gone, silenced by a drone strike that had torn through the heart of their mission. The cost of courage. The days that followed were a blur of grief and defiance. Amira's apartment, a cramped room filled with books and half-finished articles, became her sanctuary and her prison. She sat at her desk, staring at the photos she'd taken that night, blurry images of the crater, the mangled remains of the tent, and Anas's lifeless hand still gripping his camera. Each click of her shutter had felt like a betrayal, capturing death instead of life, but she'd kept shooting, driven by the need to bear witness. Her phone buzzed. With messages from colleagues and editors, urging her to publish the story, to name the attack for what it was, a deliberate strike on journalists. But Amira hesitated. The threats had escalated since the attack, anonymous voices on X warning her to stop digging or face the same fate. She thought of her mother, who lived alone in Rafah, and her younger brother, Tariq, who dreamed of studying abroad. Could she risk their safety for the truth? Sami came by that evening, his face gaunt with exhaustion. He dropped a stack of papers on her desk, notes from Anas's last story, smudged with ash but still legible. He was working on something big, Sami said, his voice low. Proof that the blockade was targeting medical supplies deliberately. He wanted us to finish it. Amira's throat tightened as she read Anas's words, meticulous and unflinching. He'd documented shipments turned back at the border, patients dying for lack of insulin, children losing limbs because of delayed surgeries. It was the kind of story that could shift the world's gaze, if only for a moment. But it was also the kind of story that got people killed. "I can't do this," she said, pushing the papers away. "Not now. Not after." Sami grabbed her hand, his grip firm. "Amira, this is what we do. This is why Anas died. If we stop, they win." She pulled away, her eyes burning. "And what about us? What about my family? I'm not like Anas. I'm not fearless." "Nobody is," Sami said softly. "He was scared too. But he kept going because he believed in you, in us. Don't let his death be for nothing." That night, Amira lay awake, the hum of drones a constant reminder of the fragility of her world. She thought of her father's poetry, of Darwish's words, "We love life whenever we can." She wanted to love life, to hold on to hope, but the weight of loss was crushing her. Anas's death wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a warning to every journalist in Gaza, a reminder that truth came at a cost. The flame of hope. The decision came at dawn, as the first light filtered through her window. Amira sat at her desk, her fingers tracing the olive branch pendant. She couldn't let fear win, not when Anas's story was unfinished, not when so many voices depended on her to speak. She opened her laptop and began to write, weaving Anas's notes with her own, her words fueled by grief and defiance. The story took shape over days, each sentence a battle against despair. She interviewed survivors of the strike, their voices trembling as they recounted the chaos. She spoke to Layla, the nurse, who slipped her a USB drive filled with photos of empty medical shelves. Amira's article grew into a tapestry of human stories, mothers begging for medicine, children drawing pictures of a world without bombs, and journalists risking everything to show the world what Gaza endured. As she wrote, Amira felt Anas's presence, his courage guiding her hand. She remembered a conversation they'd had weeks before, sitting in a cafe near the hospital. "Truth is our weapon," he'd said, his eyes bright with conviction. "It's the one thing they can't take from us, no matter how hard they try." She clung to those words now, letting them anchor her as she navigated the fear. The day she submitted the story to her editor, Amira felt a flicker of hope, fragile but real. The article, titled "The Cost of Silence," was published online within hours, spreading across platforms like wildfire. It detailed the blockade's toll, the strike on the journalist's tent, and Anas's legacy of truth. Messages poured in from readers around the world, some offering support, others condemning her for taking sides. But Amira didn't care about the criticism, she cared about the people who saw Gaza's pain, who felt the weight of lives lost. The reckoning. The article's impact was immediate and dangerous. Amira's phone buzzed with new threats, and her mother called, her voice trembling with fear. "Come home, Amira," she pleaded. "This isn't worth your life." But Amira couldn't stop. She felt a fire inside her, a need to honor Anas and the others who died. She began planning a follow-up story, one that would name the systems and powers behind the blockade, even as the risks grew. One evening, as she walked home through Gaza's labyrinthine streets, she sensed someone following her. Her heart raced, but she kept her pace steady, clutching her camera like a lifeline. The footsteps grew closer, and she turned into an alley, hoping to lose them. But a figure stepped into her path, a man she didn't recognize, his face half hidden in the shadows. "You're Amira Khalil," he said, his voice cold. "You should have stopped after the hospital." Her breath caught, but she stood her ground, her father's poetry echoing in her mind. "I'm just telling the truth," she said, her voice steady despite the fear. "What are you afraid of?" The man didn't answer, but his eyes flickered with something, doubt, perhaps, or shame. He turned and vanished into the night, leaving Amira trembling but unbroken. She knew the encounter was a warning, but it only strengthened her resolve. She wouldn't let fear silence her, not when so many depended on her voice. The legacy of light. Weeks later, Amira stood outside Al-Shifa Hospital again, this time at a vigil for the journalists killed in the strike. The crowd was small but fierce, holding candles that flickered against the night. Sami was there, his arm bandaged from a shrapnel wound he'd sustained that night. Layla, the nurse, stood beside him, her face etched with determination. They were joined by families of the fallen, their grief a shared language that transcended words. Amira stepped forward to speak, her voice carrying over the crowd. "We lost Anas, Hassan, Noor, and so many others," she said, her eyes scanning the faces lit by candlelight. "But their stories live on in us. They died for the truth, and we will carry it forward, no matter the cost." As she spoke, she felt the weight of her own words, the responsibility of being a voice for the voiceless. She thought of her dreams as a child, of her father's poetry, of Anas's unwavering courage. The pain of loss was still there, sharp and unrelenting, but so was hope, a stubborn, defiant hope that refused to be extinguished. The vigil ended with a moment of silence, the candles casting a warm glow over the hospital's gates. Amira looked up at the sky, where the hum of drones was faint but ever present. She clutched her pendant, the olive branch a reminder of the peace she still believed in, despite everything. The truth was her weapon, her light in the darkness, and she would wield it for as long as she could. As the crowd dispersed, Amira lingered, her eyes on the stars. She thought of Anas's final story, now published and shared across the world, sparking conversations in places far from Gaza's borders. It wasn't enough to change the world, not yet, but it was a start. And for Amira, that was enough to keep going, to keep writing, to keep loving life whenever she could. The story ended, but the truth lived on, carried in the hearts of those who dared to tell it.